Order, order. Welcome to this morning's evidence session. This is the first session in our scrutiny of the Railways Bill, which was introduced to the House of Commons on the 5th of November. We'll be hosting two panels today. In our first panel, we'll be hearing from the Independent Regulator for Britain's Railways, the Office for Rail and Road. And during our second panel, we'll be hearing from representatives of the rail passenger and the rail freight sectors. So please could I ask the first panel to introduce themselves.
Yes, good morning. I'm John Larkinson. I'm Chief Executive of the Office of Rail and Road.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephanie Tobin. I'm the Director for Strategy, Policy and Reform at the Office of Rail and Road.
Welcome. So, as the regulator, do you think the functions and duties of Great British Railways as set out in the bill will enable it to be an effective system operator?
Yes, they will certainly enable it because what GBR is given is some considerable powers. They are set up as a direct in mind for the railway that they're responsible for. They're set up as an empowered organisation. The Secretary of State has quite strong powers to give directions, if necessary, to course correct or steer them in a particular direction. And if you look at particular areas like their role in access, they are given a very strong role there in determining who gets access to the network. So I think it is set up as a very strong system. But then I suppose you've also got to look at what else, what are the other sort of pieces of the jigsaw, because within that broad enabling role, there's still quite a lot of policy development to be done. So there's a long-term rail strategy which will sit above that. And then when you drill down into any particular area like access, there's a whole series of decisions to be made about the policy around access. So I think yes, the short answer is yes, but there's a lot of pieces in the jigsaw. And I guess the only other thing would be not in terms of the system operator, there's people inside GBR and there's people outside GBR, and hence that interface. I mean, 25% of train kilometres are outside GBR. So that interface role for the system operator within and without is crucial.
So that's really helpful. But do you think also that there's anything missing from the proposed functions and duties of GBR that, in your view, would better enable it to fulfil the government's objectives to produce better services both for customers, for passengers and other customers?
I think our overall view, I'll bring in Stephanie in a second, but I think our overall view is that the duties now are aligned between, for example, ourselves and GBR, so they've been simplified and aligned. The functions of GBR are very wide-ranging. I mean, it is literally the operating, maintaining of the railway, the running of services, the fares. Their scope is enormous. I mean, this is 100,000 people with a £20 billion plus turnover. So I think that they've got a huge scope there. But that's the starting point, because if you think then about how the process will work, I mean, just taking one process, the funding process, the Secretary of State will need to set out, and the Scottish ministers will need to set out what they want to see from the railway. They'll need to talk about the funding for it. Great British Railways will have to produce an integrated business plan. And I personally think that's going to be one really big feature of this system, that you'll have an integrated track and train business plan. So I think it's only when you see, I mean, that's when effectively this framework will be given its practical effect through all those things yet to happen, particularly the business plan, which will set out what GBR is going to do. But Stephanie, do you want to add anything?
I think it's just important. I think that point is very important about the framework and about the different parts of, if you like, the jigsaw. And you asked about the functions, and then the duties are how you would apply the functions. And then there are other key things, for example, directions from the Secretary of State, guidance from the Secretary of State, the GBR licence, and then all of these other policies. So it is a far bigger picture than just looking at the bill. You have to look at this whole thing in context, which is very powerful.
Okay, thank you. Alex?
Thank you, Chair. The general duties that apply to GBR are the same as those that apply to ministers and the ORR. If these duties apply to all, are they not going to be so vague as to be rendered meaningless?
I can see why you might think if you've all got the same duties, you end up with almost like groupthink across all the duties. I can see that. Actually, in practice, I think not, because if you look at the nature of the duties, I mean, they all cover the sort of areas which, bluntly, you would expect to see people like GBR and ourselves covering. And if we map our old duties onto what our new duties are, effectively what they really do probably is put them more in a bit of plain English than some of our old duties, and remove the ones which frankly are probably a bit dated because they were set up more than 20 years ago. So I think in practice, in terms of the way the system operates, we don't see that the duties, the alignment of the duties has been a particular problem area. It all depends, of course, how you use those duties and how you actually deploy them in practice, because they have, I mean, none of them sits above the other. And so like ourselves, where we have to decide what weight to give to our duties, GBR will need to decide what weight to give to its different duties. So again, it goes back, I think it's the same thing we were talking about. It's a framework that gets you to sort of the start line of this, but it's how it all happens in practice. That's it, and there's a long way to go on that.
Just to add, I think it is actually very positive to have the shared general duties, just because it reduces that potential for friction in the process, and everything is meant to operate more smoothly, more streamlined, and so putting everybody aligned with the same duties is actually quite a positive, powerful tool.
Thank you. And then alongside its shared general duties, the Office for Road and Rail has also got specific duties for safety and to promote competition. These duties already exist in statute, though I think you were just saying before they were a bit dated. What does the bill do to modify them?
So in terms of our health and safety functions, the health and safety at work act still applies, and largely speaking our health and safety role is unaffected. And that, I think, in terms of the overall impact on us of this bill, there are some major changes to what we do, which we'll probably come on to later, but there's large sections of what we do that are unaffected. Our health and safety responsibilities are largely unaffected. I think that reference there is really just referring to make sure we coordinate sort of our economic work and the health and safety work. The actual powers are wholly unaffected by this bill. Our powers as a competition regulator are unaffected, and we took action a couple of years ago in the rail signalling market, which we thought was over-concentrated. Those powers are still there. We've taken action in the rail catering market. All those powers are still there. The big change in our competition powers is that we cannot use our competition power in the access area. And that, I think, is very clearly related to where we've used our competition powers in open access decisions. So that bit goes, but broadly speaking, competition powers are unaffected, health and safety powers are unaffected. And in fact, lots of other things that we do in terms of consumer law powers, so we have the power to step in, as we did recently on what you might say is mis-selling of tickets, they're all still there. So no, there's no big overall effect on our other roles.
Thank you. Rebecca.
Excuse me. The bill also places a duty on the OOR to have regard to guidance given to it by the Secretary of State. Will this duty inhibit your independence?
We already have guidance from the Secretary of State and from Scottish ministers, so we're quite familiar with working under that sort of framework. We've not found it so far to be a problem. Obviously it will be different in this environment. We expect the guidance could be quite more substantially more detailed and focused on our work with GBR, but I don't think we found any issue with working underneath such guidance.
And so how do you foresee the duty being used in practice then? So you've just alluded to the fact that you think it might be more detailed. What happens if that level of detail stops you from actually being able to do your job going forward? It
tends to be focused at how you fulfil your job and certain aspects that the Minister would like you to pay particular attention to. So the reason I say it could be more detailed is because our role will expand. We'll have a broader role across all of GBR's functions, so you can see that the duties will need to apply in a broader way. But I wouldn't expect it to be at that level of being quite so specific as you're suggesting. It should be focused on how we fulfil that role under the Act.
Okay, thank you. Baggy.
Okay. Will the OR have sufficient powers to enforce GBR's compliance with its licence?
I think that gets us on, I think, probably to the change in our role. So it might just, if I could just take sort of 30 seconds just to explain what the big changes are to our role, because I think I will get to the exact answer to your question, but I think it is just worth pausing on that, because there are some fundamental shifts in what we do, in the sense that Stephanie's just said. One big change is the scope of what you might call our monitoring role. At the moment, a lot of our non-safety monitoring role is focused on Network Rail. In the future, it'll be focused on Great British Railways, and Great British Railways has a much bigger role than Network Rail, because it not just does the infrastructure, it does the train operations, it does fares. And we will be monitoring, Great British Railways will be monitoring their business plan, which will cover track and train for everything they do. So it's a big expansion within our role, and indeed we may get guidance on that from the Secretary of State. So that's a big expansion of our role. But if you look on specifically going to our enforcement powers, would be on streamlined and reduced overall, I think, from what they are today. So our enforcement powers in the future will be concentrated on enforcing the licence. And the government's made it very clear that they expect the licence to be a streamlined, a narrow licence compared to what it is now. So that would effectively, for example, we would have in the licence there would be a specific condition on long-term asset sustainability. We would enforce that. But we wouldn't enforce, say, train service performance. So recently we took action a couple of years ago on poor performance on Wales and Western. We wouldn't do that in the new system. That would be for the Secretary of State. That wouldn't be covered by the licence, which is streamlined. So we now focus on specific things like that. So it'd be very much around long-term asset stewardship. And that's actually something which we think is absolutely crucial for the role of a regulator, because in any system, basically, and this is a sort of political point with a small p, you get a lot of political pressure on the rail system. But rail's got long-term asset lives. Rolling stock lasts a long time, bridges and tunnels last for hundreds of years. And so what that's designed to do is to make sure that GBR just doesn't focus on the short term, but on the longer term. And I think that's quite crucial. And so it really is just a shift in terms of what we do enforce on and what we don't. And then there's entirely sort of new areas that come up. So, for example, because GBR sells tickets, it's got a retail function. The question is, well, okay, GBR's got a retail function. It brings together 14 train operators' ticket systems into one place. If you're a private sector ticket seller, where does that leave you? And so there'll be for example, a code of practice around ticket selling, which we will work on with DFT. And ultimately, when that's been agreed, we will have an appeals role, hence an enforcement role in that. So I think that's an area where there's just been very big changes. That's where the system brings really different roles for the ORL.
Okay, so that's helpful as in setting the scene, but what levers will you have at your disposal? What will it look like, to the public in practice?
So if you took the example, going back to that question of long-term asset sustainability, supposing it looked from the way that GBR was performing, that effectively they'll focus too much on the short term and not enough on the long term. So you might end up, say, in a place where it looks like you're just building up unsustainable amounts of work to do in 10 years' time because you're just not looking after the assets properly. We would have the power to intervene. We'd have the power, I think, to issue an improvement plan and say you need to do this differently. So there will be sort of teeth to those specific areas. And I think that goes back to Stephanie's point about the streamlined licence. It's about very specific areas where we would be able to intervene. But
I think Ollie wanted to come in at this point.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I was just very interested, John, in what you said about the ORR will not regulate performance. That would be Secretary of State. Do you have any concerns about that? Because there's lots of stuff in the bill which we're going to get into about how the Secretary of State will have various powers and jurisdiction, and obviously GBR is going to be sort of a body of the state, and yet, of course, GBR will also oversee performance for lots of things that are not bodies of the state, freight operators, open access, etc. So, do you have any thoughts as to how that will work in practice if the Secretary of State will, and the department presumably will then take over responsibility for regulating for performance?
It comes back, I'll bring Stephanie on this as well, but it comes back to, I think, the underlying philosophy of the bill, which is GBR is ultimately accountable to the Secretary of State, and that is the design of the system. And GBR has lots of functions, as we were talking about earlier, things it has to do, one of which is operate the railway and look at the performance of the railway. But the Secretary of State effectively is overseeing those functions in terms of enforcement powers. What our role would be within all that is effectively, it goes back to our expanded monitoring role. So we would be expected to monitor all those areas. We would be expected to report to the Secretary of State. And crucially, I suppose, from our perspective, I think, we do that in a way that we do it now. So we're independent. We can basically choose what we want to monitor. We have the ability to report publicly, and that public reporting, I think, is important because it brings other people in who can debate whether we're right or not, and we can escalate issues with Great British Railways. Ultimately, if we get to the point where effectively we just disagree, the next step is that we would have to go to the Secretary of State, or indeed to Scottish ministers, and decide what to do next. So it is a different system in that sense. Shall I just bring Stephanie in case there's anything to add on that?
We've been described as an independent, trusted advisor, so we're very much in the role of giving advice to the Secretary of State, and that monitoring role will help us fulfil providing that advice. But it's very much done by design to create ORRs, if you like, a counterweight to what's going on, and to be able to channel our expertise into the Secretary of State to then decide whether or not to take action. So John's original point, we will not be taking action under the licences we do now. We're very much directing the Secretary of State where we think they need to look to consider things further, and we can expand on that as appropriate.
And some of that counterweight is that longer term piece as well, because you've got the short term issues. But if we felt that in all that system, in a sense, so much focus is just on short term performance, and there's not enough on what's happening to keeping the system going 10 years from now for passengers and for freight, then we'll be able to step in on that using our powers under the licence.
Okay. Alex, did you want to come in at this point?
Yeah. You sort of seem to be referring to GBR as a kind of really great cohesive one big body, but presumably the way it's going to be run, it will have a kind of regional structure of some description, because all big organisations do. Do you see your role as enforcing standardisation to make GBR into a cohesive whole?
So I think you're almost certainly going to be right. I mean, I'm not sure anything's been said publicly about the internal structure of GBR, but given that it's an integrated track and train body, and given that normally you'd expect an organisational design, the integration would take place somewhere effectively near the front line talk thing. You'd have operational business units near the front line on a geographical basis. I'm sure that will be the case. That then comes to really a design structure about how GBR is going to work, because the question is what sits above those sort of working frontline integrated units, and I'm not sure. I don't think much has been said publicly about that, and that goes, I think, a little bit back to those sort of pieces of the jigsaw, because in terms of how this system works, yes, the organisational design of GBR plus its operating framework, because if you think about all the bits it's got to interface with, it's going to be interfacing with the Secretary of State, who will definitely agree some kind of framework agreement around it, governing sort of financial issues and things like that. We need to interface with Great British Railways, because this is a massive transformation of the system. I don't think it's hard to overstate how enormous this change is going to be. We're going to have to transform with that, and we're going to transform with it. We're going to have to decide exactly how we lock into the GBR system. I suspect there's some way to go on designing that system, frankly.
It sounds like something fairly fundamental about going from being a regulator to being an advisor.
I don't think that's... Sorry, just if I'm not such quite right in a sense.
Maybe that's too simplistic.
Because certainly, I mean, there's no doubt that some of our enforcement powers have gone. That's absolutely clear. But I think the role has been quite extensively reformulated. So we do retain enforcement powers in some areas, and this relates to GBR as a whole. So that's about England and Wales and Scotland and whole country. We have a crucial role in terms of the interface between GBR and the non-GBR bit. And sometimes the way the discussion goes, everyone's in GBR, they're not. A lot of people are outside GBR.
Going to come on to that.
Yeah. And so, in a sense, that interface around being able to appeal things that you're not happy with if you're outside GBR, I think that's still there. But it is a fundamental redesign of the system.
Yeah.
Can I make, sorry,
Sure, go on. Yeah,
just
go on,
one
Stephanie.
just to complete the circle really on the question. The thing that does entail consistency is the GBR licence. So that does not vary by the business units, and we will still be the regulator enforcing the licence. So this is, we almost have this dual role, but I think that is the point you were asking. We're not going to enforce consistency, but that licence does underpin it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to come in still?
Just briefly, I mean, I think what's really interesting, and it goes back to the point that Baggy made about what passengers will see. And I mean, I think this is one of the things we're going to see over the theme of the bill is actually, even the way you talk about GBR as separate to the Secretary of State, I think from a passenger perspective, they're going to think GBR is ultimately the government running it rather than a separate body necessarily. And so I just sort of, I mean, and even the point you've just made about the non-GBR bits, I do feel like if you're the public, it looks like you're losing teeth to be able to actually hold to account if you are just advising, as Ruth has just alluded to. And particularly, I know we're going to do open access, but just while we're on this point, if you're just an advisor and you're telling the Secretary of State what you think they should do, surely that's a step back from where we're at at the moment in terms of offering a railway that is what passengers want. And, you know, at the moment you're in that regulatory position, you've got those powers, but it sounds like you're a complete step back on that. And from a passenger perspective, that it's not going to be visible. And I hear what you're saying about the future and the 10-year strategy, but from a passenger perspective, they're not going to be looking in terms of 10-year strategy. So how would you respond to that?
I think, again, it goes back to the different setup of the system. That, I mean, effectively, if you look back to the design of this, you've now got the passenger watchdog.
There's passenger watchdog as well. Okay.
Yes, that'll be a part of the system. And indeed, some of our roles, so at the moment, let's take some particular aspects of the passenger experience. So at the moment, we have responsibility around things like issues of accessibility, accessible travel policies, about passenger complaints, about passenger information, and we have powers effectively to set standards in those areas. The idea is that some of our functions there will transfer over to new passenger watchdog, which will grow out of transport focus, and that will effectively bring the sort of passenger perspective in that one place. And going back to the point about, well, you know, who's enforcing all this? You know, who's enforcing that? The way the system's designed is that because those things will be in the licence, and we enforce the licence, if the passenger watchdog effectively comes to an impasse with Great British Railways 2 on something, they can then say, okay, we're referring this to you for enforcement. So some enforcement functions are effectively now consolidated within us, even though other people are doing them. But your central point of has our role been cut back in certain areas? Yes, particularly in some of the enforcement areas. Has our overall monitoring, advice, recommendation, publishing, independently and transparency type role, that's expanded. So it is a mix. I think is the short answer.
Thank you. That's helpful. Baggy, actually.
Thanks, Chair. Touched on the business plan earlier, and just going back to that. Then the department have said that the ORR will be able to scrutinise performance across the full scope of GBR's business plan, but will do so in an advisory rather than an enforcing capacity. What's your reaction to that?
My reaction is I'm clear that what that means for us, what we have to do, because as a chief executive, and we've had these conversations internally, what we now need to do is different from what we currently do. So it takes us into areas that we've not previously been involved in. It requires us to have an understanding of trade-offs now and the value for money of trade-offs in that business plan. So as I said before, I do think that integrated business plan is absolutely fundamental feature of this. It also links to the funding process, which we might discuss later on as well, I suspect. But so in those areas, our role has changed. What we do will be different. How we do it, I think, will be different. And I think we're going to need to develop new capabilities to do it, because it will involve some skill sets that we don't currently have. So in terms of the future design of ORR's capabilities, where we need to go, that's now part of the plan that we indeed will be discussing with our board about what we need to do differently. I think that the thing about that we will be reporting publicly about this. So our advice on the business plan will be published advice, and that's So as an independent regulator, that ability to publish things that we want to publish, and then for also inform what you might call public debate and a parliamentary debate about it, that those things remain in that way.
As fundamentally, though, in your view, can a regulator hold a public body to account for its performance if it's got no enforcement power?
In that sense, no, because we wouldn't be doing it, because it is, that again, it's a design of the system. Effectively, the Secretary of State now takes a sort of stronger overall sort of accountability, and this system is designed around Secretary of State. Ultimate accountability goes through her, with some areas where effectively there's a sort of what you might call a specialist enforcement role that we do, and subject to a wider range of advice, drawing on the fact that the government wants an independent regulator, they want a source of expertise. I think that's one of the things that we do have, is sort of deep expertise in some areas, and we also have the power to speak out. But it is just a different system by design, I think.
Would it be helpful if there was some sort of mechanism where you could, if the Secretary of State, for example, doesn't take the advice and doesn't listen to you, should there be a mechanism to be able to sort of challenge that, or do you think the fact that you'd put stuff in the public domain, would that be sufficient?
I mean, ultimately, we support government policy, and if this is the direction of travel in legislation, generally, I don't think it's my job to say no. The government ought to do it differently in that way. The question, so the system will be what the system will be, and we need to make sure we're ready to fulfil our role to the best possible way we can. So I think it is just different.
Okay, thank you. Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. As we've alluded to some of this already, the bill allows for the Secretary of State to issue guidance and directions to GBR. Do you envisage that the RL will have any role in that issuing process or scrutinising that guidance and direction?
Yes, I think we would. In terms of the particular aspect, I'll bring Stephanie in a minute on this one, the particular aspects of any directions that were given that we would expect to have a role. I mean, in practice, if you look how it works now, even when the Secretary of State issues guidance to us, or Scottish ministers, effectively, generally speaking, you see a draft. There is a conversation that it doesn't come out the blue, in sense, as a practice. So in that sense, I think you would expect, effectively, that this wouldn't be something that would be done lightly, and you'd expect there to be a process around it, and of course it'd have to be public. So yes, we'd expect a process to be set up to determine how that would be done. And in what circumstances would you see the Secretary of State would issue directions and guidance to GBR? Is the bill clear on that? I don't think it's on the face of the bill in that sense, but certainly in the government response, or this response to the explanatory notes, there was a particular phrase that was used that this is not so much a forward-looking directions; it's what I think was called course correction. Broadly speaking, we don't like the direction you're going on here, and we want you to do something different. I guess from the perspective of GBR, that the question would be. And I think you've already seen this in some of the debate that led up to the bill. It really depends how many times you do it. Clearly, if you're to the point of absurdity, if you're issuing directions every day, the system breaks down, doesn't it? Directions are only really meaningful if you use them, I think, reasonably sparingly. And I would have thought, if you're looking in the perspective of GBR seeing itself as an empowered body, a guiding mind, you wouldn't want to be having too many sets of directions.
Thank you. Right, we're going to move on to funding of the whole thing. Baggy.
Yeah. Are you content with the role that the ORR will have in relation to GBR's funding process?
Yes, I think I'm clear on this in the sense that it's actually in some ways really similar to the current funding process. In the sense that the Secretary of State and Scottish ministers will have to set out what they want and how much money they've got. That's pretty similar to how it works now. We will continue to run the process. And by run the process, that means things like setting the dates for the process and things like that. And you might, so just a slight digression, but you might think, well, what's the big deal around that? And why would the government sort of want someone the regulator to run the process? I think, frankly, because it's been shown to work, because we're able to name a timetable and force everyone to stick to it. If you've got a politically driven timetable, bluntly, it's probably a bit harder to stick to. But and it's been shown to work that if we say it's all going to be done by this date, people do it. So we will continue to run that. The fundamental change in the system, going back again, is that whereas in the previous funding process, it was just about Network Rail, now it's about the whole of GBR. It's the operations plus the infrastructure. It's a much bigger business plan. And so that's fundamentally different. There's a technical difference in the moment that at the moment it's called an access charges review, but it won't be called that in the future because we're not setting access charges, which we might come on to later. But I think that's a technical digression. But you've now got a Great British Railways integrated business plan, and when that's set up, the question is, what does Great British Railways need to assume? And I think this again is a fundamental difference from now, because the big difference is, where does Great British Railways get its money from? The big difference compared to Network Rail is that Great British Railways will get some of its money from fares. So it's now got an income stream from fares, it's got an income stream from commercial operations like property or something like that, which is the same as Network Rail. It's got an income stream from people outside GBR. So if you're running a train outside GBR, you're paying access charges to GBR, so it's got one of them. Plus, it's got whatever grant the government decides to give it for operations and for infrastructure. And then I think that brings us to the final point. Well, where does that sort of leave you at the end of the day around the funding certainty that GBR has? And what the bill makes clear is that GBR will get 5 years' worth of infrastructure funding to operate, maintain and renew the railways. That's the same as Network Rail gets now. That's certainty. I think that certainty is really, really important. It's really important for the supply chain, for everybody else. But the other bits of its funding and for its operations are not fixed for 5 years. They will be determined ultimately through the spending review process. So I think there's quite a few subtleties in the way this system is going to work. But in terms of, I think your ultimate question, yes, I'm clear how it works. Clearly, it's a big task to actually set this all up in practice. But I can sort of see how this is going to work and what needs to be decided to do it. I'm just going to pause there and see if Stephanie, if I missed it.
No, I think that covers it all.
Okay. So, in your view, is the department right to exclude for the time being funding for passenger services from the periodic review process?
That's a choice that the department has to make, and I can see why they do that. And I think what they've also said is that the system may evolve over time, which presumably will partly depend on how successful the system is, I suspect. But I think that's a choice rather than something that we'd have a strong view on.
Okay, and then finally on funding then, are there any other provisions for GBR's funding that should or should not be set out in primary legislation?
I don't think there's anything I can think of that probably should be in the legislation. The only thing I would add, I think, is just it's around the timing, because the funding system is one of the things that has some of the biggest time lags built into it. Because if you think the current funding system for Network Rail runs out in April 2029, so you need to work back from there and think, what do you need to have in place effectively to have the new system in place in time? And that so I think there's a timing element to it which would have quite a big impact on your overall timetable for setting up GBR. You know, if you're putting sort of key sort of points on the timetable grid, getting to the point where the new GBR is funded under a new regime which will have to be designed, I think is a key bit on your project plan. I think will be my only comment, but I don't think that's an issue for legislation.
Rebecca, did you want to come in here?
Just on that funding piece, do you think there should be measures in the bill to ensure that the private sector still have confidence in investing in open access or across the wider rail network?
You know, I'm not sure about the bill. I mean, there is for example, the specific requirements that have been put on us, for example, to look into whether, for example, the access regime is encouraging private sector investment. So that particular sort of, we have particular jobs to do in that sort of in that area. in terms of the face of the bill, I think that's probably again a design point of the system, really. So do you want to do?
I think it's quite hard to envisage what that would look like. But in the current bill, and I'm sure you'll come on to the access regime, there are key elements that will give confidence or potentially undermine confidence in the bill. One of them certainly is on the capacity duty, which as currently drafted would appear to ensure that GBR retains capacity for passenger services first as a priority before it thinks about its other duties. So, and you need to ask other parties around this, but that capacity duty may give concern to people that are outside of GBR who are thinking at what point will they be thought about in relation to getting capacity on the network.
I think if you add to that, if you think who are the different private sector interests on this, because you've got private sector as in terms of freight and open access, you've got private sector in terms of, say, the supply chain, which is a huge part of the private sector, and then you've got private sector, going back to one of the earlier questions, where you've got, if you're sort of a private ticket seller competing against GBR to sell tickets, what are the protections on you? So I think it's probably useful to see it in the context of different elements of the private sector. But again, I think that's probably a more design issue, but in some cases, as Stephanie was saying, there are very, very specific provisions which you can see would impact differentially on different people outside the system, which we'll probably get onto in the access areas. But
infrastructure in this country seems to revolve around 5-year funding periods, and at different times we've heard people talk about a 30-year plan for rail. And certainly private sector investors, but customers of all types of rail, surely are looking for some longer term periods. So how do you see the 5-year funding cycle fitting into a rather vague commitment to 30-year investment plans?
Well, I guess in terms of sort of long-term strategies, I mean that's a matter for the government to decide what he wants to put in the long-term strategy. We said we don't really have any.
The link between strategies and funding in that longer-term period.
Well, again, that remains to be. You can set a long-term strategy, but as I suspect you probably know better than I do, is the government of the day decides how much to fund on it. I think you can.
And on that, because in some other countries, the operator, the equivalent to GBR, has that confidence that they have that longer-term funding available, so that they're not at the behest of electoral changes. Do you advocate that, or are you saying that's not for me to say?
I'm going to go with the latter on that one. It's not for me to say, but I would make one point that I do make when, and I've had this debate with numerous organisations, including the supply chain, is that sometimes the way the 5-year settlements are presented, it's almost like you've got a cliff edge. You have a 5-year settlement, and let's assume there's no money. You know, all my contracts drop away. I have never ever seen that happening. I've been there for 20 years. That's never happened. If you look at, broadly speaking, things like renewals contracts, you don't suddenly have your contracts halved the next year. Contracts run across the control periods. Now, it's not a perfect system, and I've had this discussion, but it's not as if there is no certainty going into year 6. Broadly speaking, workflows are in line, and unless you get a government that has decided something radically and utterly, totally different, and effectively sort of remove all maintenance work on the railway or something like that, you're talking about percentage variations. And I do think that's a point worth making. Although when I do it, a lot of people don't agree, so I'll just make that point too.
Okay, I think a lot of people will be thinking HS2, electrification projects, etc. But
I suppose that's different because we're not really involved in the setting of enhancement funding, and I think the enhancement funding again will be different. It will be out with some of the sort of core processes here.
But it impacts on the wider.
Indeed, yes.
Now we've touched on, we've had mention of network access already. So I'll go to Scott to start this round off.
Thank you. But just to rewind a little bit, the percentage variations that you talked about, the uncertainty that generates them, that's basically leads to higher ticket prices for passengers, which means fewer people use the railway. I mean, that's the challenge, isn't it?
In terms of the amount of work?
You're talking about the control period,
yes.
the uncertainty, percentage variations, that leads to higher ticket prices, fewer people will use the railway. So a longer control period does make sense.
It could make sense. The downside is that you lock yourself into something where you can't predict. As you get further out, you do not know where the circumstances are. And that has always been, frankly, just the tension between the longer you lock yourself in for. Yes, in one sense, you give more certainty. On the other hand, you give yourself less flexibility to adjust to changes in events. And that's why, inevitably, the argument, in my experience, has ebbed and flowed. Should it be shorter? Should it be longer? Ultimately, that's why you end up conversations around about 5. But you're absolutely right in the sense that even if you think 5 years is too short, having a degree of 5-year certainty, that's the sort of thing that has generated efficiencies in the rail network supply chain. We would not have had the network rail efficiency gains that we have seen over the last 10 years without that funding certainty, because it allows the supply chain to plan, like you say.
I guess thinking out loud, the parliamentary term's been 5 years as well, doesn't help. So onto open access. Earlier, you were quite matter of fact. You said that ORR would no longer be the gatekeeper for open access operators. Is that in the interest of passengers?
It's again, it comes back to this feature of the design of the system. The system is designed to give GBR an integrated role and a powerful role, and it's designed effectively to shift to a system where GBR is doing a forward-looking timetable. It's the ability to redo the whole timetable. Whether you think that's in the interest of passengers or not, I think it depends on where you think that's all going to lie.
I'm asking you what you think, though. I'm asking you what you think.
I think it's really hard to answer that question in the round, because passengers are, there's 17,000, 18,000 train services a day. Passengers are a massively diverse group. If you were sitting on an open access service thinking, I really like this particular service, then clearly you might think that's not in your interest. If you're looking at the system as a whole, you might think to yourself, okay, the question is, am I concerned that open access operators taking money off my publicly run services? And people just have different perspectives. I'm not trying to duck the question. I just think it's very hard to answer it.
You're very diplomatic. You're very diplomatic. But I guess from the public's perception, GBR is going to own the infrastructure, it's going to be running the services, so it does make sense, doesn't it?
Well, yes, that's the design. I mean, it owns virtually all the infrastructure in Britain, apart from things like the high-speed one network and Cardiff Eye lines and things like that. It runs most of the service. I mean, 25 miles of train kilometres are outside GBR, including Scotland, Wales, and our system. But yes, that is the model that GBR.
Then I guess if it was cynical, I'd be worried that a poorly run GBR, the first casualty would be to force out ORR operators. Is that a legitimate concern?
That comes to, I think, some of the things Stephanie was mentioning earlier about the fundamental design of the system. On what basis is GBR deciding how to allocate capacity on the network? And if you look at the way the Act set, there's particular clauses in the Act. I mean, I'll bring Stephanie in a minute to talk to some of those clauses. There's particular clauses in the Act where the question is, how are they perceived if you're sitting outside GBR? How are they perceived if you're an open access operator, say, or indeed any operator outside GBR? I think it's worth, we'll pause on that in a second. And there's then just the crucial document, I think, in all this is the access and use policy. GBR has to write an access and use policy, and that decides the basis on which it will decide to allocate capacity to who. And within that, it has to determine a test for doing it, and that test has been called an economic test, or I think a best value test. So effectively, you have to say, based on this test, we're going to allocate services. That they are fundamental design issues, which I think will get to the heart of answering your question. Because I think until you've seen those bits set out, and until then you've also seen our appeals role, for example, around it, it's really hard to say what would be the impact of this system, which is why I'm not ducking the question. I just don't think we're there yet. And which is why, can we just pause, just run a second? Could you just run through some of the sort of key bits of the Act where...
Yep. So we haven't really talked about closed numbers, so apologies for not doing that. But the access and use policy is absolutely crucial, and that is clause 59. It's in part 3 of the Act, and that is what a lot of the people that you're talking about will be paying great attention to. So how do they get access to the network? How will the criteria be set for that? What is this test that John talked about? And that's going to be a public consultation, and that can happen before royal assent. So Network Rail will start, actually have already started working on that now, and we expect to see a discussion document on that put into the public domain. How is this going to work in future? Because it is going to be extremely difficult, extremely different even. And we will also have to design at the other end of this. So on one end, they're granting access, and the other end, we are an appeals function now, whereas at the moment, we have a great role in granting access to open access operators, quite a significant role. That will all completely change. So looking at these key documents, access and use policy, how the appeals function will work, will be key for all these operators. But one thing I wanted to come back to is there is no suggestion that open access operators will be pushed out the network. Their contracts will continue until they are due to terminate. And that is where things could change depending on what GBR looks at in terms of future use of the network. But the objective is to get the best use out the network, and that will be for GBR to decide. So that's quite a key difference.
So very briefly, Chair, on the appeals role, do you feel ORR has the power, the right word, to get the data it needs from GBR to make the right decision on any appeal?
We still have the same information gathering powers. They are quite substantial powers. We've never had any difficulty getting information out of Network Rail. So I do think we can do that. And just the important thing will be that that appeals process will also happen transparently. So we will be looking for information from GBR, other operators will be making representations, and that should happen. There should be transparency in that, so people can look as we're going through this process, deciding what should happen.
Bingo. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ollie, I think. Do you want to come in on access at this point?
No,
you're
no
fine for now.
supplementaries. Happy to carry on, Chair. Thank you.
Your question was answered. That's brilliant. Thank you, Rebecca.
Just before I ask my main question, just focusing on what you've just said in terms of your changed role, that's coming across quite clearly that your role is going to change quite significantly. It's also allowing you to obviously give advice, but then also to have binding powers in some scenarios. So could you just set out what some of those scenarios are where the ORR would have binding powers in comparison to just an offering advice to the Secretary of State?
So the one we've talked about extensively is whatever is in the licence, the GBR licence. So the GBR licence will be set by the Secretary of State, and we will enforce that licence. So we can't, we can see some things in the Act that are going to go straight into the licence. For example, there was the one John talked about extensively on asset management. There's also the one on the retail code that we mentioned. But until we see the layout of that licence, and that should be consulted on before royal assent, we can't guarantee exactly what our powers will be in relation to enforcement. But some of our new powers are set out in this access section of the bill. I mentioned the access and use policy. We will be a statutory consultee on that. And I also mentioned our new appeals function, which is in clause 68. And that will give us powers over some of the key documents, whether or not, so for example, the access and use policy, whether or not the provisions in that are appropriate. And also give us a power of appeal over decisions that are taken under that. So we do have powers to ask GBR to reconsider things, to give it directions on things to reconsider. We can quash decisions. So there are a variety of powers depending on the circumstances.
Okay, but none of that's going to be clear until you actually see the licence.
One would be the licence, one would be developing our own appeals function, and the other one would be the development of the access and use policy.
So just briefly, the question I was supposed to ask. Apologies.
Don't worry. No, it's important that people ask questions that need asking.
Is there sufficient provision in the bill for scrutiny and input from stakeholders to the access and use and infrastructure capacity policies? And will you have a formal role in producing these documents? And just a final point, will that be something that the Bill Committee get to see as the legislation is going through the process? Because there's a lot of legislation going through at the moment where codes of practice, guidelines, whatever you want to call it, don't get given to MPs to scrutinise. And so we're basically expected to produce the legislation without understanding what the details
Certainly
are
the
going to be.
case that the access to news policy will be consulted on, and my understanding is, I don't think the government's given data on this, but my understanding is that shortly there will be an access and use policy discussion document published. So this won't be the access and use policy, it'll be basically what are the issues around this access and use policy. And indeed one of the conversations we're having in government at the moment is, and Stephanie's having, is how when what we're trying to do is get to the point where that access and use policy discussion document's issued, and at the same time we publish a sort of discussion document about our appeals role. So people on the receiving end of all this can think, okay, that's going to be something about the policy, that's something about the appeals role. And then over time, the aim would be to get that access and use policy itself published in draft. Now, as Stephanie said, I think that is a key step. So I think there's going to be quite a lot of opportunity for consultation, and quite right too, it's going to be a really important document.
And who makes the decisions on what is then in those final documents? There's a whole lot of consultation. I mean, the entire bill is about consultation. Who then makes those final decisions? Because if it's not in the legislation, we don't know, like, does that sit with the Secretary of State? Does that sit with you? Does that sit with GBR's management?
Ultimately, the documents are owned by GBR. In terms of your question, your very specific question about would the bill committee have an opportunity to scrutinise, and that's a question of timing. I'm not. I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Okay, thank you. Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. Some interesting developments over the last few months have been things like certain letters to the ORR about open access, which, of course, worded very diplomatically, but I don't know. My verbal reasoning would assess was basically telling you to not give any of it. In your view, could clause 63 in the bill, which is the capacity duty, as currently drafted, allow GBR to override its other duties, which it says are important, such as promoting the interests of rail freight?
I mean, certainly, as drafted, that's what I would say it appears to do. Yes, I would say it's very much an overarching power, and it doesn't seem to be subject to its duties, other duties. So that, on the face of it, is a very, very strong power indeed. The question is, I think, what's the actual intent behind it on that.
I think you also need to read it in conjunction with clause 18.4, which gives it that sort of everything is subject to the one you've just talked about, the capacity duty. So reading them together, it would appear to be a very strong power.
Very strong indeed, yes.
Very clear answer.
Okay, so is the right of appeal on network access decisions via the ORR a realistic one? And do you feel the ORR in its new guise will be genuinely able to act as a fair appellate body, given the duties it's to be bound by?
So it's our job now to effectively define this system. There's no, if you think about, if we compare it to the current role that we have, it's more narrow in terms of the things we can look at, and it's weaker in terms of the power to actually do things. I mean, at the moment we have extremely wide powers where effectively we can substitute our decision for somebody else's decision. This won't be like that. But what our aim is to, within effectively the design parameters of the system, to produce a robust appeals role where it's very clear what people need to do to go into the appeals system and how they would do it. And that goes back to this consultation document we're going to issue. But it will be different. And perhaps one way of looking at it is what's within scope. What's within scope of the appeals? All these sort of documents that are being produced, like the access and use policy and things like that. And then there's the actual decision itself and what we can do, what decisions within our scope. And Stephanie, did you want to come in on that?
But just going and just to talk about what then the powers will be for us, we'll be assessing whether or not decisions have been lawful, whether or not they're reasonable, whether they've been procedurally fair, and whether they are rational. So we'll be very much applying judicial review principles to those decisions. And we can quash decisions, so we can make the decision void on the basis of what we find there. So it's quite a it is effective test, but you would expect GBR to be making appropriately lawful decisions. But where that is not the case, we do have power there. And as John talked about, we can also look at the provisions in these various policies and say, well, we're not sure this is a clear provision, someone is challenging it for various reasons. And for the decisions, so again, the two areas where appeals can happen, we can remit the decision back to GBR and we can give a direction on what we think they should look at. Now, it's all, I think just saying it in the round, it's still to be developed in much more detail.
Okay, so that might be the answer to my final question in this section is, under the provisions in the bill, how likely is it, do you think, that the ORR realistically could overturn an access decision made by GBR?
I think on the basis of lawfulness and reasonableness, procedural fairness, one would expect that GBR would perform their decisions effectively in that area. But there is scope in other areas for decisions to be pointed back to them with some very direct guidance. So I think we can make it an effective process, but John's point at the start is we cannot substitute our own decision. We cannot look through the merits of the decision again, because that would put us in an incredibly powerful role, which is potentially, as John described, where we are now. That power has to shift to GBR to take decisions about the network it's running.
As a direct in mind, going back to the design philosophy.
Okay, because I think everybody would want to avoid JRs for these kind of decisions. So that's interesting. Thank you. Right, we're now going to move on to a couple of questions about the passenger watchdog. Jacob.
Thank you. What will your relationship be with the passenger watchdog?
Passenger Watchdog will grow out of Transport Focus, and we have a very close relationship with Transport Focus now. Indeed, in London, we share an office, so we know each other well. We work together in many areas. Some of the government sort of key differences that the committee might want to be aware of. It goes back to the point we were discussing earlier about a particular set of functions in terms of what we do. Will transfer over to the passenger watchdog. So this is about things like making sure each organisation in the railway has an accessible travel policy. It's about delay guidelines around delay compensation and complaints. It's a rail ombudsman. Those sort of things will shift over, and the passenger watchdog will basically take on our role of being able to set standards in those areas. So there's now a sense of new interface between them and us. We'll have a memorandum of understanding to say how we're going to do it, but I think we're pretty confident about getting that to work, because we already know how each other works. But what we do have to do is effectively design some new bits about if the passenger watchdog thinks enforcement action should be taken against Great British Railways, they will come to us. And effectively then ask us to take that on, go back to this sort of streamlining of who does what. So I think we're reasonably clear on the relationship. We're clear on some things that have to be decided. From my point of view, obviously this is quite sort of more direct and personal, because this affects some of our staff who will be moving to a different organisation. So this has a different dimension, I suppose, in that sense for me as chief executive. But broadly speaking, we are clear on what we want to achieve. We've already had some discussions with the passenger watchdog, but of course they'll be working closely with the government, and hence they'll be having a conversation about what the government wants them to focus on.
So some of those functions, like the alternative dispute resolution, that are currently provided by the Rail Ombudsman, are going to be absorbed into the passenger watchdog. What do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of that?
I think what the government wants to do is effectively consolidate certain things under an expanded transport focus. So it goes back to that design philosophy of you having a sort of basically a transport focus with a wider scope to represent the passengers. That's what the government aims to achieve in that. But because the government also wants to effectively streamline and consolidate things, so you haven't got things sort of cross boundaries, that the enforcement role around that stays with us, because it's enforcing against the licence. So in that sense, it's clear. It's clear to us what the aim is. Is there anything you wanted to add?
Just the The advantage really of moving the Ombudsman into the Watchdog is really that the Ombudsman generates information about escalated passenger complaints, and the transport focus role, and indeed the new role as the Watchdog, is still incredibly important to gather insight on where passengers are having issues. And so bringing that together should help, but the Ombudsman has to remain independent, if you like. So it is a strange sort of world where it will sit with the passenger watchdog as it sits with us now, but it is its own body, and we set a lot of the contractual rules and the terms of reference and the operating model around it, and that will shift to the watchdog.
In fact, it is now a contract between us and the Ombudsman. It is a separate body in that sense, and I think that setup will be maintained, I think we assume.
And just on that, do you think at the moment the bill as drafted will provide that harmonious relationship between yourselves as the ORR and the passenger watchdog, or does it need to be amended to achieve that?
My general view is that it's clear as a system design, and as I said, we've all got very good working relations with Transport Focus, which will be the basis for the watchdog anyway. So it's not an area that we're particularly focused on in terms of, if you think of all the areas that we think need a lot of work and development, this is probably not the area where since we think needs the most work in that sense.
And do you think these arrangements with the passenger watchdog will actually create a better service for passengers that want to complain about and improve poor service that they're receiving?
I think it goes back to Stephanie's point in that sense. You've got a bit of consolidation. So if you think of the data that you're generating within that organisation, then in principle that should allow Transport Focus, the passenger watchdog, to have a richer data set and insight, and also draws a sort of clear line. They have their own escalation procedures and debates with Great British Railways, but they still have a point to go to if they feel that debate with Great British Railways has broken down. They can still come to us, and we can see that in the context of all the monitoring that we do of network of Great British Railways, and see that in the round when we work out how to take any enforcement action there. So yes, I do think the design is clear.
Just one thing to add. I mean, we can see one of the points of having an ombudsman is to ensure that the industry gets better at dealing with its own complaints. That is effectively the whole ethos, is that they don't really want a complaint to go to the ombudsman, and we can already see that happening, in that less complaints are getting to the Ombudsman because the industry is having to deal with them. And in the GBR world, it will completely transform how it deals with complaints overall, I would expect, to try and get more efficiencies and effectiveness out of that. But no, as John said, it should be an important part of the watchdog. It will generate insight.
Okay, thank you very much. Steph?
Yes. Starting with the premise that good accessibility design benefits everyone, it obviously particularly benefits people with specific accessibility requirements. And we're seeing some changes. So we've got the passenger watchdog's got statutory powers for the first time. We're seeing, I think, your role change in terms of the enforcement of accessibility standards. I wonder if you just describe to us, you've done quite a lot of good description of where it's going from and where it's going to. Can you give us a version of that on the topic of accessibility, please?
So there are two ways to answer that. The very specific requirement that I think you might have been alluding to was the accessible travel policies that the operators produce, and they're very detailed and they help passengers understand the services they would expect, and we set guidance around that. So that's what is being defined as a standard, and it would be for the passenger watchdog to basically own that standard now. They may wish to change the standard, they should monitor the standard. However, if there is an issue with that, then they can still come to us for enforcement. So that moves from ORR to the new watchdog. But the other aspect I think is important is that ORR still retains requirements around accessibility that are enforced through health and safety law. And that is probably something that came from the last committee that looked at accessibility, is that accessibility standards are quite widespread. So we have standards over rolling stock, over new stations, and over very specific items about, for example, how you would deploy a ramp at a certain train. And because it's all enforced through health and safety law, that stays with ORR, which comes back to the other point that it is essential that ORR and the watchdog work very closely together.
Well, just on that specific about the accessible travel policies, I mean, pretty much every single thing in the railways had to have a accessible travel policy as part of its licence conditions, but presumably what's transferring over to the passenger watchdog is a much broader remit, because there are going to be far fewer licences to inspect and presumably far less detail in the travel policies, or do you have confidence that those ATPs will be just as detailed and specific?
There was previously a desire to reduce the number of accessible travel policies so that there could be a more harmonious picture for a passenger, and they would be able to pick up one document and it would apply across the network. And that, I think, is probably, although we've not discussed it in detail, still an aspiration, but different areas and different networks, different operating conditions, for example, driver only or step-free stations, you need to have something that covers all of the angles of your particular area and the train operation. So I'm hoping that that will simplify and potentially, but it needs to be clear to passengers what they can expect.
In those ATPs, there is quite a level of detail in some cases. There's the policy of accessible travel, but then there's this lift needs to go from this level to this level at this station. And I'm just worried that the granularity, which is what really affects passenger experience, one bit of that going wrong makes the journey unviable. That granularity might get lost. Sort of from a more strategic perspective, John, are you confident about the detail being retained?
In some ways, I think ultimately it's up to the new passenger watchdog. But I think our view would be that they've been shown to be effective as policies, because, as you say, they've had a certain level of detail, but how you actually go about delivering that detail, each organisation has some freedom effectively to tailor it to their own area, which I think makes sense. Otherwise, you get really over rigid specifications. So ultimately, that will be a call for the passenger watchdog. But given that we've worked quite closely with them on these in the past, and so they've seen. This Transport Focus has seen what works and what doesn't work. So I guess I'll be a little bit surprised. And it does go back a little bit again to some of the interface point, because the lift point's a really good example in terms of sort of lift design and things like that. But also lifts are an asset management issue. And we've actually spent quite a bit of time recently with Network Rail on the fact that the lifts are just failing too often. And so, again, we'd expect to see those sorts of relationships that we have to internally on those sort of things. We'd need to make sure that we are using some of those relationships in terms of what we see on the assets to help the watchdog out, because that goes about on the ground. If you can have a lot of policies, but if the lifts are failing, then you're not really delivering them. And that was one of the things that we just became quite glaring to us in terms of particularly repeat failures, which was, we think that's now improving, but that would be a good example, I think.
Okay, thank you. Just one quick thing. You've had not a duty, but part of your scope has been to promote accessibility in the past. We've talked about your new role in terms of enforcement, but whose job is it to promote accessibility? And I suppose that builds on some of the comments that we've made so far in passing about some colleagues worry about where the passenger is in all this. Like, who's going to be the front line leading the charge of that need to be more accessible?
If you look at Great British Railways duties, I mean, the passengers are right up there. Indeed, if the way Great British Railways in principle and the government described the system, it's very much sort of giving the passengers a very high priority. So I would think you would expect to see, and you go back to that business plan, I'd be very surprised if you didn't have a Great British Railways integrated business plan that didn't try to bring together some of the accessibility issues that are currently in the train operators and some of that in the infrastructure manager at Network Rail, and join them up, because that, again, that's got to be the sort of point of this, I think, really. And that's why I think the integrated business plan is a potentially really powerful tool that you can't sort of say, well, I'm not really taking into account because it's her job or his job, sort of type thing. You've got to bring the two together. That should be the driving force, and effectively GBR should drive it, and then the passenger watchdog and ourselves should have a monitoring and potentially enforcing role. But if it doesn't come from GBR itself, it doesn't really work.
We've gone from a sort of advocacy-based approach where, essentially promoting accessibility is down to advocate groups and tasked specific duty holders within the ecosystem, to one where basically the system brings everyone together. That's good, but it's only as good as the direction it's being given from the top. So is what you're saying that it's the Secretary of State's job to promote accessibility ultimately?
Well, I think it's quite clear within GBR's duties to do it. Clearly, the Secretary of State has the ability to issue directions to GBR. So if she or whoever's Secretary of State at the time wants to send an extra clear message, then that would certainly be one mechanism of doing it, yes.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. You're done
Yep,
on
I'm done.
both those questions?
Yes.
Yeah. Our report on called Access Denied, Rights versus Responsibility, took the area of accessibility on transport far wider than just whether you have level boarding or lifts, etc. More than just the physical spaces, but talked about the culture of transport organisations and an expectation that operators should be responsible for ensuring that services are available. You mentioned the list, and their information is there, rather than putting the onus on the passenger to have to push and then make a decision whether or not to travel. And that goes to things like the availability and competency of passenger assist, for instance, and clear and real-time information about whether a specific service like a lift is available or not. Do you think the culture of the rail sector has adapted yet to take on that wider responsibility that we were recommending in our report?
You've been quite closely involved in this, Stephanie.
Yes, so this just reminds me, on Friday I was on a trip between Glasgow and Edinburgh with a lady with a visual impairment and her assistance dog. And we had a great discussion about culture, actually, and she does think that staff are dramatically different from what they have been in the past. She thinks there has been a cultural change, but that is not universal. But we witnessed that actually face to face, where there was an issue with her booking. Somebody was not being as helpful as perhaps it could have been, but somebody else was walking by and immediately jumped in and decided to help. So for me, that was quite eye-opening to see. It was, and we discussed the passenger assistance service and the app at great length, and we still are very wedded to the power that has, and that it should be rolled out across the network. It is an incredibly good tool, and you will be aware that with the bill there was obviously an accessibility roadmap published. Now I'm sitting on the joint board that's been put together to deliver on that roadmap, and a lot of that deals with moving forward with the app, and the app should have the functionality in the future for the passenger and the member of staff to speak and to communicate with each other on what's going on, and just to take it to that next level that people will understand, that they feel more secure that their assistance will be there waiting for them when they arrive.
Which is fine if you've got a smartphone and you can
Exactly.
your abilities are able to use it. Ollie, is your question answered, or you're okay
Move
for
on,
now?
Chair.
I just have one final question on passengers that's often raised. Is the safety of women and girls on the rail sector and other vulnerable groups? Do you feel that the rail bill incorporates that aspect, even if it isn't mentioned specifically? Or where do you think that should appear? Should it be in the rail bill?
I don't think it's a clear, fundamental topic, and it's an area we've all spent quite a bit of time discussing in the past, and indeed debating the various options. Whether it's something for the rail bill, I think that's probably a more matter for government rather than us, to be honest.
Okay.
So I'm not trying to duck it. I think it's a government choice about the scope of a bill, really.
Well, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the first panel with the ORR, and I'd like to thank you both very much for your evidence today and the time you spent preparing to come to us today. I'm going to suspend the meeting for a few minutes while our next witnesses take their places. The sitting is suspended. Order, order. Welcome to our second panel. Please could I ask you each to introduce yourselves? Steve.
Steve Montgomery, Managing Director of First Group's Rail Division.
Maggie Simpson, Director General of the Rail Freight Group.
Nick Brooks, I'm the Secretary General of AllRail, the International Association of Independent Passenger Rail Companies.
Okay, so to each of you, what's your reaction to the general focus of the focus of the bill, the duties, particularly the functions and duties of GBR as set out in the bill? Steve.
I think our reaction is that it is light on detail to understand how it's going to affect all operators. Clearly the bill is something that we have supported. As First Group, we supported the bill when it was first set out to bring GBR into place, and that we looked for a body that was able to set a strategy for the industry going forward. What we see so far through the bill is something that requires us to have more detail and understanding, particularly where we operate open access services is clearly a fundamental part of that in the long-term future. As nationalisation comes into play, again, it's government's policy. We're not now against that policy, we have to accept that. But what happens to the other services that we provide to the industry, I think we hoped there was a great opportunity to bring public and private sector together. We still are concerned that the role of private sector and what it can bring with the bill, but again we need to see more detail of it.
Thank you. Maggie.
Yes, thank you. So in today's world, Network Rail is the independent provider of the track which my members and the freight train operators and their customers run their trains on. In future, that track will be provided by Great British Railways, who also have a vested interest in 75% of the passenger trains. And so our members have, from the very beginning, been concerned that reintegration, as desirable as it may well be for passenger railway, risks an impartiality in the way that other operators are treated. And we've pressed very hard to have a framework of duties and structure for GBR that helps to offset that. And so actually we're really pleased with some of the clauses in the early parts of the bill, particularly the duty to promote the network for freight, the duty to be impartial, the duty to look at things in the public interest, so not just about the passenger fare box, but about those wider environmental and economic factors, and also the clause which requires the Secretary of State to set a target to increase rail freight. So those we think are, we welcome them, they're powerful clauses, they go some way to offsetting some of that concern that we have about that impartiality. I think the question is, are they in themselves enough to overcome some of the worries that we have in other parts of the bill that we'll no doubt get onto?
Thank you. Nick.
Well, I think as an association, and we're active internationally, what we really look for is rail growth, so passenger rail growth. And that comes to a large extent through happy passengers, to be honest with you. So our members are active all across the world, in Europe, the United States, Australia, doing open access and competitively tendered contracts for concessions. And rail reform happens in quite a few countries. It's not just this country. It happens quite regularly all over. But this one here in this country, the UK Railways Bill, it is kind of a once-in-a-generation chance at reform. It will introduce a guiding mind, which we have in other countries too, built around GBR, but with most, as far as I can tell, most key decisions on strategy, capacity, access, what we were talking about in the previous panel, fares, ticketing, they are flowing through GBR and the Secretary of State. So my concern is that when things go wrong, GBR personnel can potentially say, we were following the minister's instructions, while the ministers can say, well, operations are GBR's responsibility. And the passengers, happy passengers, they're left in the middle because no one is really clearly accountable. So I think the question that we have is, as AllRail, is a new framework is very welcome, but will it make life easier for passengers or harder? And for you as well, will growth be delivered? Will there be better affordability? And that's key, lower fares to attract people to the train. And we have some members, for example, just in France, just this month, where they have managed to reduce the fares by 18%. This is in the south region of France. Not just freeze the fares, actually bring them down, and that's resulted in a 48% growth in passengers over the last half a year. So affordability, but also for the taxpayer, so those of you that are providing the subsidy. And so is there a clear single point accountability, single point, for both passengers and for yourselves who represent the taxpayer? And so I think our view is that with a handful of targeted changes to this bill, it can support a growth railway that is what we all want.
Cheaper fares, but more opportunity to travel. I think that is what we all want. Ollie.
Thank you, Chair. What is your view on the ORR's downgraded power to merely, quotes unquote, advise the Secretary of State on GBR's performance rather than having actual powers of enforcement? Who'd like to go first?
You want to go first?
I mean, I'm quite worried about this. I'm quite sure the ORR will do a very good job of that monitoring role. You know, we've seen them do that on the highway. So, I'm not for one moment casting aspersions about their abilities to do that adequately. But, you sort of have to ask the question, why don't you just appoint a consultant? If what you want to do is go out and monitor and report back, what's the add-on here? And obviously it's an expertise add-on. But their role, if the Secretary of State turns around and says, I hear you, but I'm still not doing it, what happens then? And I think, for GBR's own trains, there'll be a huge political accountability for the Secretary of State. Of course there will, and so there should be. That's how it works. But for freight trains, that political accountability won't be there. So if GBR decide to downgrade or not maintain the bridges so we can't run the heavy trains, for example, and the ORR monitor that, and they go to the Secretary of State and say, the bridges are all being downgraded, why is the Secretary of State then going to act? In a cash-constrained world, GBR will say it costs a lot of money. So we're really worried that loss of independence in terms of the action will really significantly impact on those people whose fare box isn't going back into GBR.
Yeah, and just following on from that, I think the fact of the independence element of it, masking your own homework is a big concern to ourselves. How do we ensure that we don't see a perverse behaviour that GBR looks after its own operations to the detriment of others? And again, who's going to, I'm not saying that MD would do that, but if there was behaviours like that, as the ORR get any power to stop it? And as Maggie said, does it just mean it gets put up to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State is then saying, yeah, well, I believe that they're acting in a reasonable way? How do we get confidence that we will not be treated unfairly as operators that are not part of the GBR operation?
Okay, thank you. Anything to add, Nick?
Yeah, I can only echo that. With GBR writing the rules and controlling capacity and being also linked to the main operator in the country, there is a structural conflict of interest unless there's a clear duty of fairness and non-discrimination. I don't know of other European countries that do not have a strong independent rail regulator across the EU and beyond. So to be the judge and the jury at the same time is somewhat worrying, yes.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca.
Thank you, Chair. What can we glean from the bill's provision for GBR's licence without having seen a draft document?
I'd respectfully suggest you can glean nothing. Obviously there are lots of, associated documents, the consultation response, fact sheets, things that the Minister has said in the House, etc., etc. And, they are all helpful, but if it's not in the bill, it's not in the bill, right? So, and I've reminded the Rail Minister of this quite a lot of times, he won't be there forever, so even if I believe what he tells me, at some future point it will be somebody else, and this legislation will outlive all of us, hopefully. So we do have to make sure that the bill itself is powerful. And I certainly think it would be reasonable for the Bill Committee to expect to see more about the licence and the access and use policy than they're currently able to.
Thank you.
I think I agree. How can you make decisions when you don't know what the full licence is, and how can everybody understand the full bill and how it will fold out? So all these bits that are missing at this moment in time, I believe there's more work that requires to be done to bring it in so that the Bill Committee can have a greater understanding, us as the industry can have a greater understanding. But at the moment, it's very, very light and fully appreciating what will happen.
Okay.
Want me to go straight to the next one?
Yes,
fine.
so,
We had some numbering issues. What role would industry expect to play in the production of GBR's licence then? And will the ORR have sufficient powers to enforce that licence once it's been set up? So there's two kind of aspects to that question. Whoever wants to go first. Nick, do you want to?
I think one thing, just to lead from your further question to this one as well, with the very broad powers for the Secretary of State and a certain lack of specificity of what will happen. I think what we're looking for is more KPIs, so key performance indicator, a little bit like in business. Realise it's a governmental entity, but still these quantitative KPIs, they're not really there. And just to give you an example of what they could be, to what extent will fares go down? To what extent will there be passenger growth? I realise there are targets for freight growth, but not for passenger growth or for modal shift. How many cancellations will there be? What will the punctuality be? We have that in other countries. What will the crowding be? Seat utilisation. For example, we know in Switzerland that their seat utilisation is 28%. It's well under their targets in Switzerland, but I'm not seeing anything specific here. And also, I think, also crucial, the last but not least, so to speak, is the subsidy per passenger mile. Yeah. So how many miles will be provided and what will the average subsidy in order to see whether it's an efficient service or not.
Really helpful. Do you want to add anything?
I mean, there are lots of people at Network Rail and DFT, working at pace on lots of aspects of this, and fair credit to them. And they are being relatively consultative in lots of places, particularly on access and use policy. But we are a very long way away yet from having policies, plans, licences that are finished, fit for purpose, in my view. So there is so much yet to do, and that makes me quite nervous because we're being expected to sign off you're being expected to sign off legislation without seeing that next layer down.
In terms of specifically on that point about the ORR, I know you sat through their evidence. Do you think they will have sufficient powers to enforce the licence once it's in place, which particularly links to your KPI point as well? Who's going to be ensuring that GBR delivers on an improved railway, which is what we're led to believe this will create?
I think from the ORR's evidence, I don't think they have got I believe they have got those powers.
You do think they have? Yeah.
I do not think they've got those powers. So again, back to the point is, who is actually going to be able and accountable to hold GBR? If it's almost managed internally, that makes it very difficult to see how you get that independence or that challenge into it. And at the moment, the industry has many flaws, as we know, but at least there is an area of challenge coming from various angles. And again, back to the overall powers of it that's left with the Secretary of State, is that really going to be an area that we believe will focus and challenge a government, ultimately a government department?
Okay, thank you. Ollie?
Yes, thank you, Chair. One of the things that fills some of us with a bit of optimism, who perhaps are not necessarily completely overwhelmed with it, either in general or indeed about this bill, is the provision for a long-term rail strategy and for a GBR to produce a 5-year business plan, which presumably will in some way relate to that long-term rail strategy, so that provides some clarity and transparent view of the industry's direction of travel. Do you have some optimism about that? Do you think that is potentially a good thing that comes out of this bill or not?
I think it would be a good thing to come out of the bill as long as the right people have got the input and there's a wider consultation on that 5-year strategy. If it's very much a strategy that's set without wider consultation with the rest of the industry, I think that would be a concern to us. We all accept that, you know, to set some certainty for the industry is not a bad thing, but it has to give everybody the opportunity to feed into it and have the ability to try and help change it and shape it in the right way.
Look, I think it's a good thing. You know, if we go to some of the clauses we'll come on to about capacity allocation, you know, there'll be best value or in the public interest. We need some definition of what government believes best interest, public value, etc. is, and that strategy will help to inform that. I think, you know, we have to be realistic about, you know, political processes. You know, a long-term strategy never survives a change of government because that's not how these things work, right? But they can inform that, you know, we've seen some relatively coherent continuation of policies over the last change, I think, in the railways. So I think it can only be helpful in that sense.
Nick, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I realise that according to Clause 71, I believe, the Secretary of State will have the ability for 15 years to alter existing access agreements and rights. So that is a bit troublesome, I think, for private investment, and I think everyone here probably agrees that private investment is a good thing in the supply chain, because ultimately the taxpayer can't fund everything. We don't just see that in the UK with the current fiscal situation, but elsewhere around the world. I mean, the fiscal problems of the United Kingdom are not solely in this country. And so you need private investment, but they then, private investors or privately owned companies, whether it's supply chain or operators or ticket vendors were being talked about earlier on as well, they need certainty so that long-term investment is not discouraged. So I think we need more certainty in terms of the Section 71 powers, ultimately.
Which
Carry on.
well, yes. I mean, it leads nicely to your supplementary, I think.
Okay. Yes. There's various things in the bill about creating a new network access regime. I'm sure many people wouldn't necessarily be overwhelmed with despair at changing the current arrangements to track access contracts, etc. But do you feel the provisions made in the bill for non-GBR operators are fair and appropriate?
No. As it stands at the moment, no.
We might say that.
As it stands at the moment, no, we have no confidence in that, again, because the access use policy has not been written yet. It's starting the discussions on it. But the ability to not understand that at this moment in time, how do you then get private investment into the industry when people don't know what part they may or may not play in the future? And that will stop decision making. The reason why we hope to set GBR up was to try and drive the industry forward and try and set strategies, start to set people having certainty about the future. As it stands at the moment, First Group as an open access operator has got no certainty around about that. You know, as we've stated previously, the fact that we are unable to turn around and say that we will retain contracts that we currently operate, or there may be new contracts in the future, is very difficult, and to be seen to be playing off of a level playing field with the rest of the DFTO operations out there. So it's really quite difficult at the moment to say that the policies and the way that they're written are going to be helpful to any of us.
Okay.
Yeah, look, I agree. I mean, for a start, I think there are two different capacity allocation processes in the bill. One is Clause 61, infrastructure capacity plans, which is what we've been told is how it will all work. And then there's Clause 63, which gives GBR the right, as discussed on the previous panel, to enforce its own services onto the network, regardless of its duties. I can't get a clear sense of how those two clauses work together. Secondly, on that infrastructure capacity plan, you know, we're in a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions, a lot of consultation about that, and my members too. And of course, saying we will award capacity in the best value, the best public, it sounds lovely. You know, who wouldn't want that? Because we're going to have more capacity for growth, our members, you know, it'll all be amazing. But when you actually start to drive down into the practical process of allocating capacity, it's very difficult. We're asking questions around, for example, how will different ports feel that they've been treated consistently. We don't know how many infrastructure capacity plans there'll be. There could be 1, 30, 200. We don't know how they'll get opened and reopened. We do know that when they reopen them, any contract, any train that's running could be removed if it's no longer judged as best value. So we're concerned that, somewhere in the middle of England, somebody reopens a plan, they judge our freight train not to be best value, even though everyone else loves it. It's incredibly complex, and if the notion was simpler and better, we're worried that we're going into something that it's very difficult to see how we get out from it, that contractual certainty that we need to make those investments. And that's not to say there isn't somebody writing this right now who's going to come up with the answer, but we certainly haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, go on, Nick.
When it comes to long distance rail, I think one of the frictions in this country is that you have concessions and open access on the same tracks, essentially between the same stations. And that is different to a lot of other European countries. For example, in France, Spain, Italy, Sweden, Germany, long distance is done entirely by open access. So that is different in this country. And I think we'd look for clarification in clause 63 that especially GBR cannot reserve capacity for hypothetical future GBR long-distance services at the expense of privately funded open access proposals or existing services that provide immediate benefits and extra infrastructure income, of course, because open access operators are paying track access fees too. So I think for that you need to prioritise open access, funded open access, over speculative GBR services one day in the future.
And could I ask a quick supplementary about a fairly specific and probably sounds niche, but I think you'll all appreciate the importance of it, aspects of the current network access charging regime, which is EC for T, which I think is a terrible acronym, even by railway standards. Electricity charges for traction, I think it is. I'm not an expert on this, but I have heard people, I think I've heard people say that in particular is not necessarily working as it should at the moment, and perhaps has sometimes been a barrier to uptake of electric traction. Do you have any, and I haven't seen anything in the bill about that particular aspect of the charging regime, do you have any particular concerns about that aspect, and would you look to this bill to improve that aspect of things? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, like a lot of other things, there's not a lot of detail, right?
No, quite.
And on the charges point, there are some clauses or some parts that we're okay with and some parts that we don't like at all. The bit that we do like is where it widens out the ability of GBR to offer a discount. So in today's legislation, the ability to offer a discount is very tightly worded, it's very narrow. So Network Rail do offer some, but it's quite constrained. So we welcome the ability to have that wider, and it'll be no surprise that one of the things we're talking about as a potential candidate is to encourage more electric traction use in freight. So that's not EC for T, but it would enable probably the same thing.
Just on that though, of course, just because you've just teased something out there, it does enable a discount, but it also enables GBR to charge more if they think that an operator can pay it. I mean, does that perhaps get to the heart of needing to make sure there is good policing of those powers to make sure they're not abused?
Yeah, so today's law, I'm going to get very techie for a minute, so forgive me. So in today's law, Network Rail can charge more, but the test is, can the market bear it? So when that's assessed, we look at, well, if you charged a port, a shipping company, a lot more money to move by train, what would they do? And the answer would be, they'll go back to road, and they go, well, therefore the market can't bear it, so it doesn't get levied. Whereas in iron ore, for example, and biomass, it's just that the market can bear it and it does get levied. The way it's been written in the new law is a much broader test, and it will make it much harder for us to segregate between different markets, and it'll make it much harder for us to just say that charge isn't justified. So it's one of the clauses we're worried about.
And I think for passenger operations in particular, the understanding the mechanism charging, if the Network Rail or GBR decide to increase the charges via Network Rail, again, it becomes a bit of a money merry-go-round between the DFT operations and Network Rail. But if you are sitting independent of that and you have to bear those charges as well, what control do you have over that? And what's your ability to try and influence that? And again, because the market, GBR says, well, that's what the market price is now. Again, who sets that rules? And we are left to pick that up potentially, which could put businesses under pressure. New applications for open access, again, how do you set that? How do you be able to try and price it? You know, we talked earlier there about discounts. How it currently works at the moment for an open access operation, you're discounted on your charges for the first 2-3 years, and then you start to step up into the charges. But again, that's about how, because of the level of investment that has to be put in at the beginning, and it gives the operation a chance to succeed. So there's all these different things that we need to look to retain for the future if we are going to bring further passenger services in this case, or freight slightly different, but certainly in passenger service, how do we bring them on?
Okay. Thank you. Could I just go on, Nick?
I was just going to say, privately owned investors, privately owned operators, well, privately owned investors specifically, that want to invest in our sector rather than other sectors, aviation, road sector, or even completely different sectors. There is a certain risk, there is a commercial risk, of course, and they are looking ultimately for lower fixed costs and more higher variable costs. So the worry is with GBR is who is determining what the market can bear. Is it an independent entity or not? I think in the bill it should be GBR itself, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a little bit like another conflict or a potential problem with track access fees. Who decides the size of the track access fees? Is it your competitor, if you're a privately owned operator, is it your competitor GBR that's deciding your track access fees? And that is a potential worry, of course.
That's very clearly put. Thank you. Can I just go back to the point earlier about long-term certainty and concerns that's been raised about the impact of short-termist political meddling or chopping and changing of policies, particularly between different governments? It's been said that those protections aren't in the bill. How would a bill look better in order to mitigate against that?
One thing that was discussed on the previous panel was the ORR's appeal function and the role that the ORR play in access. So today, for example, if one of our members, if their track access contract, the legal document that lets them on the network, when that expires, there'll be sort of a presumption that those contractual rights for trains which are running will carry forward into the new contract, and the ORR have that under the new infrastructure capacity plan. That's all thrown up in the air, and those trains may not get that continuation. And then we're down to appealing to the ORR with that weakened, with that weakened role which John and Stephanie spoke about. So I think one of the bits about that long-term certainty is about how those access contracts are played out and those committed rights play out through that new infrastructure capacity plan process.
Right, thank you. Nick? Yeah.
I think that, and I think you touched upon it earlier on in the previous channel, that long-term investment in the rail sector, some other countries do that, so it's independent of a change of government, which of course occurs in many other places, but they do it specifically for the infrastructure, so that there is planning for building bridges and tunnels and things like that over a longer period of time, not so much for the operator. So to have that long-term strategy for the infrastructure and how it will be paid, separating that from the operator, that's what other countries do, such as Austria or Switzerland, that would be desirable.
Right. Okay, now we're just trying to. You've been answering questions that we haven't yet asked, so we're just trying to keep track. Ollie, do you want to?
No, I'm happy, Chair, but I believe my colleague
22.
Rebecca is keen to ask something at this point.
Yeah, have your questions been asked?
No, they haven't. So I will
go on,
brief,
Rebecca.
And I think these all link. So I've got a question for Steve. How important, particularly based around what we've talked in the licence and making sure that access is fair and it's fair particularly to the open access people, how important is a strong independent regulator for securing those access requirements going forward?
Again, I think it is really important. We come back to GBR will be a monopoly. So how do First Group or other private sector operators get that comfort that they're playing on a level playing field? We want to continue to invest in the industry. We have invested. We've ordered new trains and orders of £500 million, which has helped, keep particularly Hitachi, Newton Aycliffe, the economic impact that we have in areas, and allowing growth. How do you continue to invest when GBR saying, we'll maybe allow it or maybe not? At the moment, at least when I go to the ORR, they're looking at it without any pressures from, I'll rephrase that slightly, they're meant to look at that independently without having, and they've got a criteria laid out that they'll look at, and whether it be revenue, forgone for the industry, do we create new revenue? Lumo is a classic example of where it's been statements made that we have taken revenue from LNER. Clearly we can demonstrate where passenger growth is up 30% on the East Coast Main Line. For all operators it's grown. Lumo's obviously new, so that's ringing me, but LNER's also grown, as has Grand Central, as has other operators. So it's really important that we have somebody that can look at that wider aspect rather than saying, well, that's all our revenue and that'll all come to us. You need competition is not a bad thing. Lumo was set up to be in competition with airlines. We changed the whole landscape of people flying between Edinburgh and London, London and Edinburgh, and we took a market share that brought us above what it used to be. Airlines used to be more dominant, now rail is more dominant and 95% cleaner than what an airline is. So there's all these different things. That's why we need somebody looking at all these different things rather than somebody saying that's our railway.
And then I think I had another one, and then that's me done.
Okay, go on, Rebecca.
Just building on that, and we asked the question to the ORR earlier, and it's something I asked the Secretary of State as well, when we were talking about the investment that has been made at Newton Aycliffe. Do you think there should be measures on the face of the bill to ensure that investors still have confidence in investing in open access, as well as that regulator piece being in place?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, private investment, as we made the point earlier, Nick I think made the point, we pay track access charges to GBR that gives a greater income to the industry to keep the infrastructure maintained. So we're something on top of what's already there, rather than being an inch of money go around. We're bringing money from the private sector into the industry. That must be seen as a good thing. And the Secretary of State's got to try and give some support to that.
Okay, Steph.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Stepping back a little bit rather than backwards or up, zooming out a little bit. And I'm conscious there are various things where we just don't know the detail, and that's affected a number of topics we've discussed this morning. But I'm interested in each of your general assessments of the bill as it is, from the point of view how it impacts your businesses and your sectors. And I suppose building on what Rebecca asked, but more broadly, do you think changes are needed to what we now have in front of us in order to perhaps ensure the right balance between a cohesive rail network and the rights of non-GBR operators, or the free access rights of non-GBR operators? I'm interested in how you see it at the moment. What's the talk of the town inside the business and the sector that you're representing? Maybe I can start with Nick.
I think to make value for money for taxpayers and for passengers, and scrutiny as well, and to tighten the transition powers so that they do continue to support and don't undermine private investment. That's a good thing. I think we've talked already about the duty of fairness and non-discrimination in terms of access to capacity, about KPIs, that they are, at the moment, the KPIs are not very specific. There should be a passenger growth duty similar to the freight duty, the freight growth duty, and keep the door open as well for competitively tendered concessions too. That's something I don't think we've talked about already today. We see benefits of them from elsewhere. So in terms of saving taxpayer money in terms of bringing fares down. So why can they not continue in this country?
Very helpful. Thank you, Nick. Maggie?
Yes, I mean, look, nationalising the passenger railway and creating GBR is long-established policy, and, you know, it's not my place to comment on that. But if I go out and talk to my members, and these are, you know, global investors, so people investing in ports, in quarries around the world, they want to use more rail freight because it's good for the environment, it's good for their business. They want to be in the UK, they want to be investing, but they're looking at this and going, can you tell me that in 10 years' time I'll be able to run the trains I want to run from my port or my quarry? And I'll go, well, that will depend on the play out of clause 61, 63, the very weakened appeals role for the regulator, whether clauses 71's got any teeth, clause 72, which gives the Secretary of State power by regulation to tell you what you can do in your own terminals. And they kind of go, you know what? Dubai's looking great, right? Yeah. You know, less hassle, more sun. See ya. You know, I paraphrased, but there isn't enough in here for those international investors to say, I am confident. Now, when we talk to the players, to Network Rail, to DFT, of course, they want to see rail freight thrive. I don't get a sense that they don't. And we see that at the beginning of the bill, but the back of the bill, the access section, it's undeliverable as it is at the moment for those key industry bodies.
Thank you. Canada.
Thank you.
Can I ask Steve the same question?
Sure, yes, sorry.
I'll just be quick then. Look, this is a huge opportunity for rail to shine in the UK, but it has to shine for the customer. And I think the fare-paying customer, the freight customer, it has to shine for them. And that means about certainty and understanding and opportunity and growth and alternatives, rather than it just being, it's always going to be that way. We've seen with open access operators, their customer service scores are way above the national operators. So we can bring different things to it and give people choice as well. You know, that's the other thing. Do I want to go by air? Do I want to go by road? Do I want to go by train? And this bill should be able to encompass all of that. And at the moment, it's too narrow and it's too, in my eye, it's too monopolistic.
Thank you.
Important to bring that modal shift point both for passengers and obviously for freight as well. Thank you. Alex, are you?
Yeah, yep, thank you, Chair. If I could just first, Nick, go slightly back to what you said before about this hypothetical GBR service being blocked by a real-life open access service. And you'd said you'd like to see some policy to address that. Where would you like to see that policy? Like in the bill, in guidance, from whom?
I think some amendment of clause 7, to get the right, 63, sorry, 63.
Okay,
some
so specifically
one,
in the bill. Yeah, that's all on that, thank you. And then, I mean, we've somewhat covered this, particularly Maggie, I think, but given the parameters that will be placed on the ORR as an appeals body for access decisions, do you think it will be equipped to act in the best interests of the rail network as a whole?
I mean, I've already started, so I'll carry on. I mean, I think there are a number of problems with that appeals function. The first is it'll be incredibly hard to ever get to it. So we're told that, you know, the appeal will have to meet the standards of a judicial review. I wrote them down: illegality, irrationality, or procedural unfairness. So there will be a very high bar to meet to even get there. And on top of that, the law allows the Secretary of State by regulation to set out some steps you'd have to take in advance of going to the ORR. We don't know what they are. And also a fee, and we don't know what they are. So even getting to the ORR will be very much more difficult, we think, than it will be today. If we do get up there, in most cases, the ORR will be able to ask GBR to have another look at its decision. Has another look, reaches the same view, so what? Only in a minority of cases can they quash a decision, and only then if there was an error of law. We're trying to get clarification of what an error of law means in the context of those access policies, that access and use document. But also then if there was only one other decision that GBR could have reached. So, you know, I'm confident that the ORR will try and set up an appeal function within those parameters to their best effect, but the parameters they're being given and our ability to get there in the first place are very, very limited. And actually, you know, conversely, the passengers are going to get a very powerful watchdog, and we feel that in freight, you know, we're having those rights of access watered down.
I think you have to ask the question, what other large public sector organisation like GBR is going to be, why would you not have an independent regulator of it? You know, why is rail going to be different from other large public sector organisations where there is a regulator looking at them?
Nick, anything to add?
Well, I think a strong independent rail regulator has two roles, and ORR, by the way, is part of the European group of independent rail regulators called IRG. And ideally it's to protect passengers and other parts of the sector from monopolistic behaviour, and it's to ensure the best use of taxpayer money, and also in other countries to ensure competition and non-discriminatory behaviour. And we're worried that that might be watered down in this country and needs to be improved still.
Okay, thank you. Jacob.
Thank you. I suppose you just touched on the passenger watchdog at the end there. So have you got any views on that? What do you think need to change, perhaps, to Steve and Nick? Steve first.
Passenger watchdog is obviously very important, and it has to have the ability to help protect the true customer out there. You know, so the fact that it's got powers within the bill is not a bad thing. You know, it will help. It just, again, back to, will it have overall authority? Can it be changed by the Secretary of State under the way the bill's written at the moment? So how do we give some clear accountability that customers can rely on, that somebody over there looking after them as well? And again, back to this large monopoly of, you know, who sets out what KPIs for the industry, and how does the customer get protected through that?
Nick, have you got anything to add?
I can only really support what Steve says. I mean, ultimately the passenger is king and queen, must be. Without the passenger, a huge amount of revenue is lost for the rail sector and goes elsewhere to less sustainable modes of transport, such as road or aviation. That's what we don't want, so the passengers have to be looked after.
And Maggie, you've highlighted in your evidence some of the conflicts that exist. So yes, on the face of the bill there's a desire to increase rail freight, but also, as you've noted, GBR is the operator of passenger services which are at competition for access to the network. So what amendments do you feel would provide protections to rail freight that you're looking for?
I certainly think Clause 68, the appeals function, needs rethinking. I think we need more clarity on, and almost certainly then amendments, and the way that clauses 61 and 63 play out in that capacity duty versus the infrastructure capacity plan. And it's really essential that we start to see those access and use policy documents coming through quickly so that we can understand more of that. And I think clauses 71 and 72, which gives us some pretty substantial superpowers to future secretaries of state to intervene, particularly in clause 72 in my case, in off-network facilities, probably need some changes as well. There are others, but they're probably the main ones.
Okay, unless any of my colleagues have any other questions they'd like to probe, I've got... No? Steph? No, you know? Okay. So, it gives you... and thank you very much for your very comprehensive answers, and obviously access and the consequences of that. And you've described very well your concerns. Are there any other aspects of the bill that you think we should focus our scrutiny on in this inquiry, and any specific changes you would like to see made to the face of the bill in terms of issues we've not already covered today? Start with Steve.
I don't have anything other than, you know, I think we'll go back through and we can write in if we believe we've missed anything. I think we've covered the main topics. One of the key areas will be the access and use policy. Again, not seen in the bill at the moment. When are we going to see something that's robust that we can then debate and have the bill committee be able to look at and see whether it's fair and transparent?
I'd agree about the access and use policy and the licence. And I think, you know, there's sort of an overarching piece about all the powers that sit with the Secretary of State and then with GBR to do things to each other at different points in time in the future, that there is a huge amount of that, and actually an overarching review of whether that is balanced and appropriate probably would be sensible, I think.
I think on the topic of ticketing, we've talked about passengers and how, well, they should have transparent options to all rail options. I mean, the passengers indirectly as taxpayers are subsidising a lot of the system, so they should ideally have the duty to be able to see and book whatever rail options are there. And if GBR is, on the one hand, to be the ticket vendor, but also dealing with other third-party ticket vendors, you can see there's another conflict of interest there. When people open a rail app or their website, they shouldn't have to wonder, is there another train? Is there another cheaper train, another faster train? Or am I really getting everything here in one place? You know, the so-called one-stop shop. So I think clarity is needed on that. And finally, devolution. We've seen some very good examples with TfL and in Merseyside. There's plenty of guiding minds for passenger rail across the EU continent. I live in Cologne in Germany, and we have a regional body there similar to TfL, and Cologne is the 4th biggest city in Germany. So I think that the government is saying that mayors should lead on integrated transport, but perhaps Clause 81 needs to be strengthened so the mayor can, or mayoress can get full statutory and financial control of rail in that region.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your evidence today, and we appreciate the time you've taken to speak and to prepare as well. The evidence we've heard from this morning from both our panels has been really helpful, and if there's anything you didn't get a chance to cover, please do write to us. We'll reflect on the evidence we've heard from both panels today, and we look forward to our next session on the Railways Bill in a couple of weeks' time. So that concludes today's meeting. Order.